stored program, 6 orders of magnitude. And so therefore this could do many things, and maybe we'll see a little bit later what type of things could be done and were done with this machine. The input and output was punched paper tape. That was even before IBM cards, which you probably know about IBM cards. And so Dr. Gerald Estrin, Jerry, we called him, these are all late, I omit this, but I was the youngest person there in this environment. And he came from the team of John von Neumann, who built the Joniac at the IAS in Princeton. And I saw an ad in the paper looking at Weizmann for electronic engineers to build a digital computer. And this fired my imagination. I was at the time in the army, and anyway, I came to the institute and met Jerry Estrin. And he knew only English, and I knew only Hebrew, because I was never in high school. Don't tell anybody else about this deficiency. And so finally I understood that he wanted me to design a multi-vibrator, if you know what it is, and even if you don't know. And I did it on the spot, and on the next, on my next visit, I was astonished to see that several copies of this multi-vibrator were built, so I understood that I was accepted. It was in 1954. What happened here?
You want to go in the other direction, forward.
Oh. Yes. By the way, so if you don't know about this, Jerry wrote a brief history about the construction of Weizac. And it's called the Weizac Years. It's in the Annals of History of Computing, 1991. You can find it on Google. But what you cannot find is a 255-page PhD thesis in Hebrew with a 9-page English abstract called One State, One Computer. It was submitted recently to Tel Aviv University by Raya Leviathan. Maybe you remember her?
I read it. I was one of the referees for it.
You were one of the referees?
Yeah.
Leo Corey was her advisor. Yes, and so it would be really nice to translate it to English. I had a visitor from abroad with whom I worked on some mathematical problems until yesterday. So I managed to prepare these slides only yesterday night, or I would say early this morning, in the early hours of the morning. And so I then wrote an email to Raya asking her, and she said that, asking her about the translation, she said that she didn't find funds for translating it into English. But if there's somebody here interested in that, I think would be useful to do. She really researched this thing in depth, and here's one of the referees of this PhD thesis, and he can, I think, attest to this. Perhaps she knows more about it than I do. Okay, so some of the names. Jerry Tzvi Riesel, he came also from the army, and he was older guy, a little bit older than me, a few years, and he was also, he took over after Jerry returned. After 15 months or so, he returned back to the U.S. And Penny Rabinovich was the head of the programming effort. He came a little later after the computer already worked. So the initiator and driving force behind the project was Chaim Leib Pekeris, the head of the Applied Math Department at Weizmann. And I don't know if you saw in the video what Einstein's contribution was or not, but Pekeris faced some opposition. 20% of the annual budget of the Weizmann Institute went into the construction, into the initial design and construction of the Weizac, and everybody at Weizmann thought it was a crazy idea to build it. And so Pekeris cleverly appointed a committee with big names like Einstein, Oppenheimer, and the real great brains. And Einstein objected. He said, "What will such a tiny country do with such a huge computer?" And but he was finally persuaded by John von Neumann that if nobody else, Pekeris will use it 7 days and 24 hours. And he was quite right. And so if you would come to the lobby of our math department at Weizmann, you would see Einstein standing there in the corner opposite the Weizac, a very bashful. Okay. So we were looking for some parts to build a computer, and we finally found some shack outside Tel Aviv, as you can see here, run by 2 Bulgarian immigrants, and they agreed to build those bakelite chassis, which you may have seen on the video. On these chassis, we put the valves, the triodes, and the resistors, and the wiring, and other electronic components. The vacuum tubes themselves were imported from the US. So what you saw on the video was only the computer's core, the arithmetic unit and the main control. The main control was actually hidden on the rear side, which you couldn't quite see, I think. The entire machine occupied the entire basement of the math department, and an adjacent building housed the air conditioning, which was needed because there were 2,300 valves in the computer, and each valve was heated. There was a huge amount of heat, and if it wouldn't have been cooled, the whole thing would melt down. There was no transistors yet at that time. So, as I may have mentioned, the machine is essentially of the IAS family in Joniak. There were other computers built at UCLA and other places. But there were a few necessary changes. I mentioned that we had 4K, and at Princeton they had 1K. So So the 20-bit instruction, so I said 40 bits, and each instruction, each word was divided into 2 instructions of 20-bit each. So in Princeton they had 10 bits for the memory address, because they had only 1 K, so 2 to the 10 is 1024. And we had 4K, so we needed 12 bits, and so only 8 bits remained for the order itself, whereas in Princeton they had 10. And that really meant that the whole main control had to be redesigned. And this was my job, which was very challenging and interesting, I thought. It's something like programming. So perhaps I got my inspiration from Ada Lovelace at the time, although I didn't know about her, but was still an inspiration. But there is this thing that if you make a mistake in programming, so you write a new order, it's just some software. But a faulty design embedded in the hardware, that's a major problem. And so therefore, Jerry, Tzvi, Riesel, and I would try at night to debug my design in order to be sure that there is no problems there. At these nocturnal meetings, Pekaris was a frequent visitor, and when he saw that even at night we are busy working for him, he quietly tiptoed out of the room not to disturb us. Pekaris wanted, among other things I just mentioned here, one thing, to study the internal constitution of the Earth. So one way of doing it is to measure the oscillations of the Earth, but they are very minute. And so instead they decided to study the tides, where you see bigger differences in the amplitude of the oscillations are bigger. And he made a model, and one of the things they found in the theoretical model is that there should be a fixed point in the South Atlantic. Fixed point meaning that there is no ebb and no flood at this place. So they sent out a flotilla of ships, and lo and behold, they found that nobody got sick on the boat, and that meant that there is really no and it's really a fixed point. He did many other things like atomic spectroscopy and many other things. Some of the names are Hans Jarosz, Yigal Akkad, Menachem Dishon. They worked with Pekaris. There were others who worked independently on the new computer, like Joe Gillis, Joel Rakach, physicist from the Hebrew University. By the way, very interestingly, with Joel Rakach, we sent him a list of the commands. This was machine language, no higher language yet. And he didn't visit at Weizmann. We just sent him this list of commands. And using it, he wrote a huge program and sent it to us by snail mail. There was no email at that time. And we ran it, and there was no bug. It ran immediately, something unheard of almost. Okay. Now, every morning, the engineering team to which I belonged, we had 2 hours for preventive maintenance, during which time we lowered the voltage and we ran diagnostic tests which made the life very difficult on various components. There was something which I wrote, which was called the leapfrog test for the memory, because the program itself sits in some place in the memory, but that place has also to be tested. So the program was leaping from one place to another in the memory. Sometimes we didn't need the entire 2 hours, everything was fine. So I ran my own program for designing computer circuitry using Boolean algebra, which is also a sort of yes and no, like computers. And that was my MSc thesis. The machine was rather reliable, but of course there were sometimes the machine was down. So sometimes, very rarely, but it did happen that at 2 o'clock at night they came and knocked on the window of the rented room that my newly wedded wife and I shared. We had married in 1956, and they called me to repair the computer. So my wife remarked that she thought that she married an engineer, and now she sees that she married a physician who is on call at 2 o'clock in the morning. The only really difficult problems were intermittence. That means some mistake that occurs maybe after a few millions of operations, say once every 2 weeks or so. And even if you lower the voltage, you don't see it. So this happened a few times, and this was sort of challenging to find the real cause of that. Of course, there were once people heard about this computer in Israel. They all congregated and came. Pini Rabinovich gave courses in programming, and they all wanted to put their hands on the computer. Pekaris wanted all the time for himself, but he had to give in a little bit. And even though, he sold the time and people paid a lot of money, but he wanted the time for himself, as John von Neumann had predicted. For example, the army had fixed time, I think, once a week between 2 and 3 in the morning. But they managed to make one of the programs operational. Sometimes they needed time in between, so they called up, and then Pekaris didn't want to give it. And so they called up David Ben-Gurion, who was a defense minister, among other things, and he called up Weizmann, who was the president of the Weizmann Institute. He was also very good in getting money for the computer. So Pekaris couldn't refuse Weizmann. He was dependent on him, and so the army got time that way. When we married in '56, a few weeks before that, Pini Rabinovich collected the holes of the paper punch, and this was a confetti which, when we went up the aisle on the wedding, so we got all the confetti on our heads. And as I don't know if you managed to hear that on the video, on the day we finally, in '55, we applied voltage for the first time. Pekaris collected all the local VIPs from the Weizmann Institute to show them that here we already apply voltage. And when we put it on, there were quite a few explosions and white and black smoke billowed up to the ceiling, and the VIPs fled in all directions. And then we quietly repaired all the shorts, and we put on voltage without VIPs. And so everything worked out fine. Chaim Pekaris was a real pioneer, but he was not an easy man. If you met him on the street and you would say shalom to him, hello, hi, good morning, good afternoon, he wouldn't even answer you. And suddenly one day he completely changed his attitude towards my wife. And he asked her, how are you, shalom, and how is your pregnancy coming along, and is everything okay? Well, that was in 62, when Weizac was already showing some signs of old age. And he wanted, and we built at the Weizmann Institute another computer called Golem. It's also interesting why it was called Golem, but that's another story. And so the Golem wasn't yet ready, and Weizac was already old, so we decided to buy a computer in Minneapolis, CDC, Control Data Corporation. Nowadays CDC has some other meaning in the United States. CDC 1604. And he wanted me to go there in order to be present at the acceptance tests and to check out that computer carefully. And I told him, I'm not going until my wife gives birth and everything is okay. And so therefore he was very interested to see that everything was yeah. Okay, and then in Minneapolis we chartered a KLM transport plane for $23,000, and the computer came. The CDC came to the institute. The army was a very keen early user of Weizac, many branches of the army. And I remember that Yoshua Bar Hillel and I went to, the effort was headed by General Yitzhak Rabin. He was very much in favor of early entrance of the army into computers, and we gave a few lectures there. And they made a nice research project, and I think Pinney helped them very much. And they decided on the Philco 2000, which came, and they really used it very well. And all the papers, when the plane came, all the papers in Israel wrote about the electronic brain, that was the name given at that time to computers, was arriving. There was one paper that wrote that this is a crazy idea, and then the state controller will come and hold them to account for wasting the country's money, and will be working maybe 1 hour a week and so on. Do you know who wrote this editorial?
Uri Avneri?
Yes. בעולם הזה.
Intelligent guess. Sounds like העולם הזה. Style of the sun too.
At Mamram, they always laughed about it later on. Okay. I think I'm already over time. So here is a conclusion. Weizac was the first generation machine. It was a culmination of the Pecker's dream. There were really days of pioneering creativity. I was at that time very naive. I didn't know about, I never dreamt about a scientific career. I didn't know about publications. Later, when I turned into a mathematician just by sheer accident, Pecker's became very angry that I stopped working for him personally, and that had all kinds of ramifications which I won't go into. So the Weizac was created in an environment without any high-tech infrastructure in Israel, quite unlike other machines of the IAS type that were built around that time. And it was thanks to the dedication, innovation of a small, dedicated team. It was the initiator of the early entry of Israel into the high-tech era, which really is nowadays, I think, the main industry of Israel. It used to be the citrus fruit, and now it's the silicon. I think that's probably the end, so thank you very much for your attention.